The lights died at 2:13 in the morning, and the screaming started 11 seconds later. Armed men moved through the emergency wing of Hartwell General Hospital like they'd memorized every corridor, because they had. They came with silenced weapons, flex cuffs, and a list of names. They expected doctors to scatter. They expected security to fail. They expected nurses to hide under beds and pray someone would save them. They were right about everything. Except one person. She was standing at the end of the hallway in blood-stained scrubs, holding a patient chart, looking like she had no business being there at all. They had no idea what they'd just walked into. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel is where the stories the world forgot get told the way they deserve. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and I want you to do one thing for me in the comments. Tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it, because what happened inside Hartwell General that night is something nobody who was there will ever forget. The town of Delridge, Montana didn't have much to offer, not compared to Billings or Missoula or anywhere a person with real ambition might end up. It had a grain elevator that closed in 2009, a main street with more empty storefronts than open ones, and a regional hospital that punched above its weight because there was nothing else for 60 miles in any direction. Hartwell General Medical Center sat on the edge of town like an afterthought, underfunded and overstretched, doing the work that no one further down the road wanted to do, which was exactly why Nora Vance had chosen it. She'd arrived in Delridge 3 years earlier with a single duffel bag, a nursing license from the state of Oregon, and a reason she never explained to anyone. The hospital administrator who hired her, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Poland, had looked over her paperwork and asked the obvious question. Why Delridge? Nurses with her credentials didn't usually stop here. They passed through, maybe, on their way to somewhere else. I like quiet, she'd told him. Poland hadn't pushed. Good nurses were hard to find in small-town Montana, and Nora's references were spotless, every one of them describing her as calm under pressure, technically precise, and almost supernaturally unflappable. He'd hired her on the spot for the overnight rotation, and she'd never once given him reason to regret it. Night shift suited Nora. The hospital was different after midnight, slower in some ways, more honest in others. The administrative noise faded. The political friction that dominated day shifts dissolved into something simpler, patients who needed care, equipment that needed monitoring, and a small team of nurses and techs who learned quickly to trust each other because there was no one else. Nora had built a reputation inside that quieter version of Hartwell General. She was steady. She was thorough. She remembered every protocol without being reminded, anticipated problems before they surfaced, and never, not once in 3 years, raised her voice. She also never talked about herself. The younger nurses had tried, early on. They'd invited her to birthday dinners and after-shift drinks at the Briar Tap 2 blocks from the hospital. Nora had declined most of them, joined a few, and spent those evenings listening more than speaking. She laughed at the right moments. She asked follow-up questions. She was warm enough that no one could call her cold, but by the end of any given evening, the conversation would somehow always circle back to the other person, and they'd walk away feeling good about the night without being able to name a single thing they'd actually learned about her. What they knew was limited to what they could observe. She was 34, maybe 35. She kept her dark hair pulled back tight on shift. She had a scar on her left forearm that she never explained, faded enough to look old but shaped in a way that didn't match any kitchen accident or car crash story. She could place an IV line on the first attempt in conditions that made other nurses swear under their breath, and twice, both times during situations that could have gone badly wrong. She had made decisions under pressure so fast and so correct that the attending physician on duty had looked at her afterward with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite suspicion, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between them. No one had figured out how to ask about any of it directly. So they didn't. She was just Nora. Night shift nurse, steady, quiet, easy to overlook. That was the point. The night it all changed started unremarkably. Nora came on at 11, took the handoff from the evening charge nurse, a tired woman named Petra, who gave her a rundown of the 4 occupied beds in the overnight ward and mentioned that a trauma admission was expected sometime after midnight from an MVA 20 miles out, and settled into the rhythms she knew by heart. She did her checks. She updated charts. She changed the saline on a 70-year-old man in bed 3 who'd been admitted for a cardiac event and was stable but restless. And she sat with him for a few minutes because he was frightened and had no family in the area, and that mattered even if it wasn't in any protocol. "You're not supposed to do that," he told her. "Sit with patients. I heard the administrator say the new rules say you can't." "Gerald says a lot of things," Nora said. "He also goes home at 6. The man laughed, which eased the tightness around his eyes, and Nora stayed another 3 minutes before his breathing slowed toward sleep. She was back at the nurses' station at 12:40 a.m. when the ER doors opened and the night got complicated. The vehicle that pulled in wasn't an ambulance. It was a black Suburban with government plates, Montana registration, but the plates were a specific sequence Nora clocked in the first 2 seconds and then filed away without reacting. 2 men in suits got out of the back, moving fast, helping a third man between them. The third man was ambulatory, but just barely. His left side was soaked through his shirt in a way that the overhead lighting made impossible to miss. Behind them came a fourth man, heavier, late 50s, wearing a jacket that cost more than most Delridge residents earned in a month. He moved like someone used to rooms partying for him. He didn't look at the building or the staff. He looked at his phone, finished a sentence into it, and pocketed the device with the particular efficiency of a man for whom time was never wasted on anything that didn't require his personal attention. His name was Garrett Holt. Nora knew this because his face had appeared twice in the last 18 months in coverage she'd followed carefully. Defense industry news, the kind buried deep in trade publications that most people never read. He ran a company called Holt Meridian Systems, a private defense contractor with government contracts worth somewhere north of $400 million. She hadn't expected him to walk into Hartwell General at 12:40 in the morning, and she kept that surprise off her face while she moved toward the intake area. The injured man's name, one of the suited attendants told the intake tech, was Sal Brannon, chief of security for Holt Meridian. Gunshot wound, entry and exit confirmed, but they needed a doctor now. Nora was already moving. She came around the desk, snapped on gloves, and got her hands on Brannon before anyone else had processed the situation. He was conscious, pale, and losing more blood than he looked. She did a rapid assessment in 20 seconds. She'd done the same assessment in worse conditions, in worse light, with worse tools, and started talking to the tech on her right without looking up. "Get me 2 large bore IVs, normal saline, type and cross, CBC, BMP, chest film if we can get the portable in here now. Where's the attending?" "Dr. Fasano is in room 3 with a—" "Get him out!" The tech hesitated. "Go," Nora said, and something in her voice removed the hesitation entirely. Garrett Holt had not moved from the doorway. He was watching the scene with an expression that suggested he found it inadequate. "Excuse me," he said, loudly enough to cut across the room. "I asked for the senior physician. Who is this person?" Nora didn't look up. She had 2 fingers on Brannon's radial pulse and her eyes on his face, and she was counting. "This person is the one stopping your man from going into hypovolemic shock," she said. "If you want to be useful, step back 6 feet and let me work." There was a silence. It was the kind of silence that followed a response Garrett Holt hadn't expected and didn't know how to process. "She's a nurse," he said to one of the suited men, as though clarifying something that had been left unclear. "She's keeping him alive," the suited man said quietly. Dr. Marco Fasano arrived from the back hallway, still pulling on a glove, took one look at the scene, and absorbed it in the way good emergency physicians absorb things, without commentary, cataloging what was already being done right and moving directly to what needed his specific skill. He caught Nora's eye, and she gave him the report in 12 seconds flat, the way a field medic gives a handoff, concise and sequential, no hedging. He nodded twice, made one addition to the order she'd started, looked at her with an expression she recognized. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. "Good call on the chest film," he said. "He's got decreased breath sounds on the right. Not tension yet, but watch it." Fasano nodded again and took the lead, and Nora stepped to his left shoulder, and they worked the way a functional team works, which is without ceremony. Holt watched this from 10 feet away. His expression had shifted slightly. The initial dismissal had shaded into something less comfortable. He wasn't used to being ignored by people who turned out to be right. The portable chest X-ray came back in 7 minutes. Small hemothorax on the right, just as Nora had suspected. They managed it. Brandon stabilized within the next 20 minutes, his color returning, his pressure coming up. By the time the night settled into something approaching normal, he was conscious enough to tell Fasano where it hurt and hold a brief conversation with one of the suited men. Holt had retreated to a corner of the intake area and made 2 phone calls. When he came back, he stood near the nurse's station and looked at Nora with the particular expression of a man who had made a mistake he needed to quantify before deciding how to handle it. "You were the first one on him," he said. "Yes." "You're a night shift nurse." Nora documented the last of Brandon's vitals. "That's what it says on my badge." Holt paused. "I apologize for what I said earlier. It was a poor reaction." "Apology accepted," Nora said. "Your man is stable. He'll need follow-up with a thoracic surgeon inside 12 hours, but he can be transported safely in 3. She handed the chart to the tech and started walking. "Can I ask you something?" Holt said. She stopped, half-turned. "How did you know about the breath sounds? That's not... Most nurses wouldn't catch that on a trauma walk-in." Nora looked at him steadily. "You'd be surprised what you learn on night shift in a rural hospital." She walked away before he could ask anything else. The ER quieted. The 2 suited men stayed with Brannon. Holt made himself coffee from the family waiting area machine and sat in a plastic chair and read something on his phone that kept his face tight and controlled. Nora ran her rounds, checked in on the cardiac patient in bed 3, still sleeping, updated 2 charts, and was standing at the medication dispensary at 1:55 a.m. when the power grid stuttered. Just once. A flicker, a half-second drop, the lights dipping low enough that the fluorescent tubes hummed in a different key before snapping back. She stopped. Her hand was on the dispensary keypad, and she stopped moving, and she listened, and in the specific way she was listening, she wasn't hearing the hospital at all. She was hearing something that didn't belong. There was a sound from the parking structure on the north side of the building. Not a car door, not a vehicle engine. Footsteps, more than one set, moving in a pattern that was deliberately spaced. She could not explain how she knew the difference. She simply did, the way certain people know things their training has made automatic. She turned from the dispensary and walked quickly to the nurse's station. The overnight security guard, a retired county deputy named Hugh Galter, was doing his 2 a.m. sweep of the far corridor. Her cell phone showed no signal. She checked the landline. Active. She picked it up and dialed the number for the security desk, waited 2 rings, and when no one answered, she hung up and thought for exactly 3 seconds. Then she moved. She went first to the cardiac ward and woke the night tech, a young man named Dion, and spoke to him in a voice low enough that it didn't carry. "I need you to go to room 2, close the door, and lock it from the inside. Don't come out until I personally knock and use your name. Don't call anyone from the room phone. Do you understand?" Dion stared at her. "Nora, what? Do you understand?" She said again, same quiet tone, and something in it worked on him the same way it had worked on the intake tech earlier. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, okay." She got him moving, then doubled back through the east corridor toward the ER intake area. She needed to know where Holt's people were. She needed to know the building's current occupancy. How many patients, how many staff, how many civilians. She was running a count in her head that had started automatically the moment she'd heard the footsteps. She was halfway down the east corridor when the power went out completely. Not a flicker. Total loss. The emergency lighting kicked in 4 seconds later, red-tinted, dim, casting long shadows down the corridor. And in those 4 seconds, Hartwell General Medical Center became a very different kind of place. The ER doors exploded inward at 2:13 a.m. She heard it before she saw it. The specific crack of tempered glass under forced impact, the hard bang of the door frame catching the wall, and then boots on linoleum, moving fast. 2 sets minimum, but the sound layered in a way that suggested more. Professional movement. Deliberate spacing. These were not panicked people or opportunists. They entered the way soldiers entered a building they'd studied from the outside. Nora pressed herself flat against the east corridor wall and was still. From her position, she had a partial sightline through the corridor window into the ER intake area. She could see shapes moving in the emergency lighting, 2 men in tactical gear, rifles up, moving in a pattern that covered the space efficiently. They weren't announcing themselves. They weren't demanding anything. They were looking for someone specific, which meant they had a list, and being on a list in a building that just lost power was a different category of problem than anything else she'd encountered in Delridge, Montana. One of Holt's suited men stepped forward from Brannon's bedside and said something. The words didn't carry through the glass. The response was immediate and physical. The suited man went down. Not shot, struck, quickly and with calibrated force. He hit the floor and stayed there, which meant he was either unconscious or smart enough to play it. The second suited man took the signal from his colleague and did not move. Garrett Holt, visible in the corner of the intake area, had not moved from his plastic chair. He was watching the armed men with an expression Nora couldn't fully read from this distance, but it wasn't terror. It was something closer to recognition. She processed that. She had 12 seconds to make a decision. She used 8 of them. The fire pole station was 7 feet to her left on the east corridor wall. She reached it and did not pull it. That would trigger the building-wide alarm and cause exactly the kind of panicked movement that would make containment impossible and civilians easier to harm. Instead, she opened the panel with a push, exposing the internal junction, and used a technique she had learned in a context she never discussed to send a low-current signal that would trigger only the localized alert for the basement maintenance office and the security substation on the north end, neither of which were in the path of whoever had just entered the building. It was a small thing, and it bought maybe 4 minutes before someone with a radio figured out what hadn't gone off. She moved. The north stairwell connected the ER level to the second floor, where the overnight ward held 4 patients who did not know their building had just been breached. The stairs were fire door isolated. She pushed through and took them 2 at a time in the red-tinged darkness, her shoes quiet on the concrete, her mind running the layout of the building against the positions she'd observed. Hugh Galter was on the second floor. She found him in the far corridor, hand on his radio, picking up nothing but static, looking at the emergency lighting with the expression of a man who didn't yet know what he was dealing with. "Hugh," she said, and he turned. "What in the hell is armed entry on the ER level? At least 4, probably more. Tactical gear, rifles. They've already dropped one of the civilians downstairs. I need you to listen carefully." Galter was 58 years old and had spent 22 years doing county law enforcement in terrain that didn't forgive slow thinking. He absorbed what she said without commentary. "How do you know it's more than 4? "Footfall pattern from the parking structure. They staggered the approach. Standard breach formation has a rear element holding an exit point." Galter looked at her for a moment in the red light, and his face did something complicated. "How do you know what a breach formation sounds like?" "I'll explain later. Right now I need to know if this building has a secondary communication channel that doesn't run through the main switchboard. Maintenance office has a landline on a separate circuit. Is it underground? Goes to the pole on South Birch. Different grid. That's what I need. Can you get there?" "I can get there," Galter said. "But, Nora, get to the maintenance office. Call Delridge PD and tell them to contact the county sheriff directly, not through dispatch. Tell them the code is active and the building is compromised." Those exact words. "Can you remember that?" He repeated it back to her exactly. "Good. Then lock yourself in with the patients on this floor and do not open the door for anyone who doesn't know your mother's first name." Galter's jaw worked briefly. "Her name was Della." "Then that's your password. Go." He went. Nora turned back toward the stairwell. She needed to know how many people were still unsecured on the ER level, and she needed to know what the armed men were actually looking for, because the answer to that second question would tell her how much time she had before this went from a containment problem to something worse. She pushed through the fire door and started down. On the landing between floors, she stopped. There was a man at the bottom of the stairwell. He was standing with his back to the wall, watching the door to the ER corridor, and he wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was in dark civilian clothing, and in his right hand was a radio, not a weapon. He was a coordinator, which meant he was connected to whoever was running the operation from outside the building, and if she could get close enough without triggering a response. The fire door above her opened. Not Galter. He'd gone the other direction. Someone else. The sound of the door had a specific weight to it that came from someone trained to move quietly, which meant whoever had entered the stairwell above her had been in the building before the tactical team hit the entrance. They'd had someone inside already. She understood then why the approach had been so clean, why the power grid had gone at exactly the right moment, why the security substation radio was producing static on a frequency that should have been clear. Someone had been inside this hospital tonight with a specific purpose, and they hadn't been here for a patient. The man on the landing below turned slightly, angling toward the stairwell wall, and in the edge of the emergency light she saw his face for half a second. She'd seen it before. Not here. Somewhere else. In a different context. In a file that she had no official reason to have read and every personal reason to remember. Her mind placed the face before the name followed it, and when the name arrived, something cold moved through her chest. Not fear exactly, but the particular sensation of a pattern completing in a direction she hadn't wanted it to go. The pieces locked. The black Suburban with the specific plate sequence. Garrett Holt's expression when the armed men entered the room. Not terror. Recognition. The insider who'd handed over the building layout, who'd mapped the power grid's external breakers, who'd known exactly which corridor would be empty at 2:13 a.m. They hadn't just come for someone in this hospital. They'd been led here. And the man who'd led them, the man whose face she recognized from a file she'd read in a different life, in a building very far from Del Ridge, Montana, was standing 8 feet below her on the landing of the north stairwell, with a radio in his hand and no idea that the nurse on the floor above him had spent 11 years learning exactly what to do next. She gave herself 2 seconds to think, which was one more than she usually allowed. The man on the landing below hadn't heard her yet. The fire door above her had opened and then eased shut again. Whoever was on the stairs above was moving slowly, carefully, which meant they were trained and patient, which meant she had a narrow window before they reached her floor, and the geometry of the stairwell closed on her from both directions. She went down. Not because down was safer. Down was objectively worse. The man with the radio was down, the tactical team was down, the blown entrance was down. She went down because the man on the landing was the thread she needed to pull, and because the person above her was expecting someone to run up, and doing what was expected had never served her particularly well. She covered the half-flight in 4 steps, angling her approach to stay close to the wall, and she came at the man from his blind side before he processed that the sound behind him was not the building settling. She got her left forearm across his throat from behind. Not a choke. She didn't need him unconscious. She needed him quiet. And she used her right hand to take the radio from him before his grip could tighten on the transmit key. He struggled. They always did in the first 2 seconds. "Stop," she said, directly into his ear, her voice barely above a breath. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need you to be very quiet, and I need you to answer one question. If you do both of those things, this ends well for you." He went still, partially from compliance, partially because the forearm across his throat had made breathing require concentration. "How many?" she said. "Total. Inside the building." A pause. The kind where a person weighs things. 6, he said. Rough, compressed. 6 inside. Rear element? 2 on the north exit. Who's running point? He didn't answer that one, and she didn't expect him to. Some information people give you, and some information they hold because it's the only leverage they think they have. She eased the pressure slightly, felt him take a fuller breath, and in the moment when he reorganized himself around that relief, she used the edge of his own radio to press a specific point below his ear, a technique she'd been taught by someone whose name she would never say in a civilian setting. And he went limp in a way that was deeply uncomfortable to cause but left no lasting damage. She lowered him to the landing floor, checked his pulse, strong and even, and moved his radio to her left hand. The stairwell above her was silent. Either the person who'd opened the upper door had heard something and stopped, or they'd retreated, or they'd found another route. None of those options were good, but the first one was the worst. A trained person who stopped and waited was more dangerous than one who was moving, because movement gave you information and stillness gave you nothing. She didn't have time to sort it. She went through the ground floor fire door at a controlled pace, keeping the door from swinging, and pressed herself into the shadow of the east corridor. The ER intake area was 40 feet ahead. She could see 2 of the tactical team from this angle, both positioned with sightlines toward the main entrance and the corridor junction, which meant their attention was oriented outward and forward. Standard coverage pattern for a team that had secured the ground and was waiting for something to happen next. They weren't searching, they were holding, which meant whatever they'd come for wasn't in the ER intake area. She looked at the room from this distance and counted the civilians visible, both of Holt's remaining suited men, one sitting and one standing. Holt himself, still in the corner, now standing with his arms at his sides in a posture that was doing a careful job of communicating cooperation. The ER tech who'd been on intake when the doors blew, a young woman named Petra Solis, who was pressed against the far wall with her eyes moving between the armed men and the floor. No Brannon. They'd moved him, or he'd been moved. She tracked the corridor past the intake area toward the overnight treatment bays and registered the faint sound of a monitor still running on backup power, which meant someone had either forgotten to pull a patient or decided not to. The radio in her hand emitted a short burst of static, then a voice, clipped, efficient, no call signs. South corridor status. She didn't answer. Silence on a radio in a tactical operation meant either the receiver was occupied or compromised, and experienced people adjusted for both. She had maybe 90 seconds before someone came to check on the man she'd left on the landing. She turned away from the ER and moved toward the maintenance corridor. The building's infrastructure ran along the east wall. Electrical panels, HVAC access, the secondary mechanical room that also housed the boiler controls and the data relay for the hospital's internal phone system. She'd walked this corridor 100 times in 3 years of night shifts without thinking about it tactically. She was thinking about it tactically now. The maintenance room door was unlocked because Hartwell General's facilities manager, a man named Bob Druitt, believed that locks on internal maintenance doors created problems during emergencies. Nora had argued against this policy exactly once, in a staff meeting 14 months ago, and been outvoted by people who'd never thought about why that policy might matter. She pushed the door open and went inside. The room smelled like machine oil and concrete dust. The backup lighting gave her enough to work by. She found the hospital's internal relay panel on the north wall, a gray metal box with a label in faded marker, and she opened it and looked at the configuration. The phone system ran on a separate battery backup from the main emergency lighting. If the tactical team had cut the primary grid, they'd done it from the external transformer junction, which meant the battery circuit was still intact and live. She traced the relay board until she found what she was looking for and then did 3 things in sequence, quickly and without hesitation, that rerouted the hospital's intercom system from its normal broadcast configuration to a targeted channel, specifically the speaker mounted in the maintenance office where she'd sent Hugh Galter. She pressed the intercom activation key. "Hugh, it's Nora. 6 inside, 2 on the north exit. Do not go north. If you haven't called yet, do it from the south landline. When the line connects, say the situation is critical infrastructure and there are federal assets involved." She paused. "Repeat back on this channel if you can." 7 seconds of silence. Then Hugh Galter's voice, scratchy through the maintenance office speaker, but clear enough. "Got it. Federal assets. I'm making the call." She released the key. She had done what she could do through infrastructure. The rest was going to require being in the building in a way that was more direct than she'd have preferred, because 6 armed people in a rural hospital at 2 a.m. with a specific target meant the clock wasn't moving in her favor. Local law enforcement response in Delridge would take 15 minutes minimum, probably 20. County sheriff response was longer. State assets were theoretical. Federal, if Galter's call triggered the right flag, could be faster, but that was a conditional she couldn't rely on. She had 20 minutes, give or take. She needed to know who the target was. She went back to the east corridor, and this time she moved toward the overnight ward rather than the ER, staying below the sight line of the intake area windows. The overnight ward occupied the back half of the ground floor. 4 patient bays, a nurse's alcove, and a small family waiting room that was empty tonight. She pushed through the door to the first bay. Sal Brannon was in the second bay, which meant someone had moved him during the breach, either to protect him or to isolate him. He was lying on the bed, still connected to the monitors running on backup power, conscious, and looking at her with an expression that was partly pain and partly something much more alert. "You," he said. "Me," she said. "We need to talk fast." Who did you call before you got here? He blinked. What? Tonight, before the vehicle. Who knew you were coming to Delridge? That's not... He stopped, reorganized. He was sharp, she could see that, even through the blood loss and the medication. The route was internal. Garrett's security director handled the logistics. And the security director's name? His jaw shifted. Patton. Will Patton. The name didn't land immediately. She filed it. Patton give you the route? He gave Garrett's PA the route. Who's the PA? Why are you asking me this? His voice had an edge now, and she understood it. He was a man who protected information by reflex, even in circumstances that should have overridden the reflex. Because the team that just entered this building knew your route, knew the building layout, knew the exact time to cut the power, and entered without triggering your men's response until they were already in the room, she said evenly. Which means someone in your logistical chain sold the information. I need to figure out how deep it goes before whoever is downstairs finds this room. Brannon looked at her for a long moment. The monitor beside him registered a slight uptick in his heart rate. How do you know all of that? He said. She didn't answer the question. Stay here. Stay quiet. If anyone opens that door who isn't me or Dr. Fasano, you get yourself off that bed and you get behind it. Understood? I'm not exactly mobile. More mobile than you think, she said. People find out what they can do when the alternative is worse. She was back in the corridor before he could respond. The radio in her hand crackled again. A different voice this time. Shorter transmission. One word that was almost a name, almost a signal, but not quite either. She'd heard that kind of truncated communication before. It was a status check from the exterior team to someone inside. And the fact that it had come through on the coordinator's frequency told her the interior team was either down one comms or consolidating channels, which meant something had shifted in the last few minutes. She moved toward the junction between the east corridor and the ER intake approach and stopped at the last point of cover, a supply alcove with a linen cart and a medication trolley, and looked. There were 4 of them now visible in the intake area, not 2. The outer team had pulled in, which meant they were no longer maintaining the north exit coverage. 2 options. Either the exterior element had been triggered by something outside, Galter's call, a patrol that happened past, a motion sensor somewhere, or they had received a signal to consolidate because the operation was entering a different phase. Holt was still in the corner, but he was talking now. Low, direct, to the man in tactical gear nearest to him, and the man was listening. Nora watched that exchange and felt the picture shift. Holt wasn't a hostage. She'd had a version of that suspicion since the moment she'd read his expression during the breach, but she'd held it at arm's length because the implications required her to rebuild everything she thought she understood about the last 2 hours. Now she let it resolve. Garrett Holt had not flinched when armed men entered his space. He had not moved to protect his people. He had stayed in his chair, phone in his pocket, arms loose. The specific posture of someone who has been told to stay exactly where he is because things are about to go as planned. She thought about the plates on the Suburban, the specific sequence she'd filed away at 1240 and not yet fully parsed. She ran it now against what she knew, and when the sequence completed, she had a problem she hadn't anticipated. The plates weren't government issue in the standard sense. They were contractor-specific, the particular registration pattern used by federal subcontractors with security clearances operating in civilian vehicles. She'd seen that pattern in a context so removed from a Montana hospital that connecting them should have been impossible. Except she'd learned a long time ago that things that should be impossible had a way of appearing anyway when the same people kept making the same decisions. The operation wasn't about Holt, it was about the accountant. She'd missed it because she hadn't known there was an accountant, but the logic assembled cleanly once she had the first piece. Brannon had been shot before arriving at Hartwell General, which meant the attack on the vehicle had happened on the road, not here. The building breach was a second phase. 2 separate strike elements targeting the same convoy meant the planners expected the first one to fail. Or they wanted it to fail, wanted the convoy to go to ground somewhere, wanted it to go specifically to Hartwell General, which was the only medical facility within 60 miles. They'd herded the convoy here, which meant there was someone in this building that the tactical team wanted, and it wasn't Sal Brannon, and it wasn't Garrett Holt. She went back toward the overnight ward, not running, moving at the particular pace that doesn't draw attention because it doesn't look like urgency, and she pushed through the ward door and moved past Brannan's bay to the third and fourth. The third bay had the cardiac patient from earlier, still asleep, still stable, no connection to any of this. The fourth bay was supposed to be empty. Gerald Pouline's intake note from the evening handoff had listed it as clean and available for the anticipated MVA admission. It was not empty. The man in the fourth bay was sitting up in the bed with the blanket pulled to his waist, fully dressed from the waist up, and he was holding a manila envelope against his chest with both arms wrapped around it in a way that looked partly protective and partly like someone who had been holding something that way for so long it had become automatic. He was in his mid-40s, average build, the kind of face that wouldn't register in a crowd. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that had been cleaned but not stitched, and he had the look of a man who hadn't slept in somewhere between 36 and 48 hours. "Who are you?" he said immediately, without preamble, and the question was alert enough that she revised her estimate of his condition upward. "I work here," she said. "Night nurse. What's your name?" He looked at her, calculated. "I'm listed under a different name." "I know. Intake listed you as the MVA from the highway. But you weren't in an MVA." She looked at the cut. "You were in the vehicle they ambushed on Route 7. His expression locked. "The same people who shot your convoy's security chief are now inside this building," she said. 4 of them, minimum, in the intake area. "You need to tell me who you are and what's in that envelope because the next few minutes are going to require me to make decisions, and I need to make them with accurate information." A long moment. Then, "Daniel Pruitt. I am a financial compliance officer for Holt Meridian Systems." And the envelope. His arms tightened around it fractionally. "Documentation. Internal. Things I've been collecting for 14 months. He paused. "Things that would create significant problems for several people if they were submitted to a federal oversight body." How significant? He looked at her the way people looked at someone they were deciding whether to trust in circumstances where trust felt like the last available option. The kind of significant that makes someone send a team to a rural Montana hospital at 2 a.m. She almost said something and didn't because there was a sound from the corridor that changed the entire calculation. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't movement. It was the specific absence of sound that replaces ambient noise when a door has been opened very carefully somewhere nearby, and the person who opened it was now waiting on the other side. She crossed the room in 4 steps, went to the window on the far wall. Ground floor, the window looked onto the hospital's east lawn. The glass was the older single-pane type that hadn't been replaced in the last renovation. And she looked at the latch. Old hardware. The kind she could work. "Can you move?" she said. "Yes," Pruitt said, already sliding off the bed. "Stay close. Don't speak. If we get separated, you go to the boiler room at the end of the south mechanical corridor, and you stay there until you hear sirens." "What about—" He looked at the envelope. "It goes with you, obviously." She got the window latch free on the second attempt. The first try, the mechanism caught on a paint buildup that someone should have addressed years ago, and eased the frame up. Cool air came in from outside, carrying the smell of cut grass and the distant sound of a highway she couldn't see. The ward door handle moved. She didn't look at it. She put her hand on Pruitt's arm, and they went through the window. The east lawn was dark, the exterior lighting having gone with the main grid, and the emergency generator powering only the interior systems. She landed on grass that was still damp from an afternoon rain, helped Pruitt down behind her, and immediately moved them left, hugging the building's exterior, staying below the sight line of the intake area windows on the far side. She needed to get back inside. She needed Pruitt somewhere defensible. She needed to know whether the team had found Brannan yet, and whether Fasano was still in the building, and whether Hugh Galter's call had gone through to anyone who was going to do something useful with it. What she had was a radio with a declining battery indicator, a 14-month financial file wrapped in manila, and approximately 12 minutes before local law enforcement response made the situation either better or significantly worse depending on how the tactical team chose to handle an arriving patrol car. They reached the south exterior wall, the mechanical room access panel, a steel door that exited onto the south loading area, and she pulled the exterior release, which was keyed to the same code as the interior maintenance panel, a 4-digit number she'd memorized in the first week because she'd been in enough facilities to know that memorizing infrastructure codes was never wasted effort. The door opened. She got Pruitt inside. The boiler room was 20 feet further, warm, loud with the ambient sound of the machinery, and dark enough that the door's interior lock would give them reasonable time if someone tried to come through. She sat Pruitt against the far wall and crouched in front of him. "You stay here," she said. "No matter what you hear. You're going back in." "Yes." He looked at her in the dim light of the single emergency strip on the ceiling. "Who are you?" It was the same question Brannon had been building toward, the same shape of question that Holt had started, and she'd redirected. She looked at this man, exhausted, frightened, holding 14 months of evidence against his chest like a life raft. And she gave him the same thing she gave everyone who asked it. "I'm the night shift nurse," she said. She went back through the mechanical corridor before he could respond, and she was in the east corridor, moving, when the radio on her belt transmitted a new signal, a tone she hadn't heard in the previous communications, a two-pulse pattern that she recognized with a cold and absolute certainty from a context so far outside Delridge, Montana, that her stride nearly broke. She caught herself, kept moving. The two-pulse pattern was a confirmation signal used by a specific federal contractor unit that operated in domestic security contexts under a classified program designation. She had last heard it used in a secure facility in Virginia 4 years ago. In a briefing she had no official reason to remember. She remembered everything. The unit didn't officially exist in any way she could point to. It operated through layers of contractor designation that made accountability nearly impossible, and gave its handlers enormous flexibility in terms of what targets they could pursue and what methods they could employ. She had left the military partly because of what she'd learned about how units like it operated, and she had never expected to encounter that particular two-pulse signal in a Montana boiler room at 2:30 in the morning. She stopped at the junction of the East Corridor and the main ER approach. 2 of the tactical team had moved out of the intake area. She could hear them in the far corridor. Not see them, but the sound of equipment and footfalls told her they were methodical, checking rooms. They would reach the overnight ward in 4 minutes. They would find the open window in the 4th bay in 5. They would extrapolate from the open window in roughly 30 seconds. She had less time than she'd calculated. And then, from outside the building, from the direction of the highway, carried through the walls as much as through any window, she heard something that changed the shape of everything. Not sirens, not a patrol car. Helicopters. 2 of them, by the sound, and not the medevac configuration she knew from the regional air transport service. These were running differently, lower and faster. The particular acoustic signature of aircraft that were not interested in being heard until they needed to be. Hugh Galter's call had gone through, but it hadn't gone where she'd expected it to go. She stood in the east corridor of Hartwell General Medical Center, holding a dead man's radio, and she understood 3 things simultaneously. Whoever had responded to that call had come faster than any county asset could manage, which meant the flag she'd asked Galter to use had triggered a protocol she hadn't fully anticipated. The tactical team inside the building was about to hear those helicopters, and when they did, the operation would shift from collection to extraction to something worse. And the man in the boiler room with his manila envelope had no idea that the people coming to this hospital were not all coming to save him. The radio in her hand transmitted once more. A voice she didn't recognize, clipped and controlled, saying 4 words that confirmed everything she'd feared and nothing she'd hoped. "Package is still inside." The package was Daniel Pruitt, and the people in the helicopters knew it. She had 30 seconds to make a decision that would define everything that came after it. The helicopters were close enough now that she could feel the vibration in the corridor floor, a low-frequency tremor that came up through the soles of her shoes, and told her the aircraft were coming in fast and low, and without the kind of approach pattern that suggested they were announcing themselves to anyone. Whatever Galter's call had triggered, it had moved fast, and the speed itself was information she needed to interpret correctly. Legitimate federal response to a hospital breach would come with coordination. Local law enforcement contacted, perimeter established, chain of command confirmed before anyone set boots on the ground. What she was hearing was not that. What she was hearing was a unit that had been pre-positioned, waiting for an intercept trigger, and Galter's call had given them the location they already wanted. She moved. The east corridor back to the mechanical room took 40 seconds at a pace that wasn't quite running but covered ground faster than a walk. She hit the boiler room door, knocked twice with the specific rhythm she'd used in other buildings in other circumstances, and pushed through. Pruitt was exactly where she'd left him, sitting against the far wall with the envelope pressed to his chest. He looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who had been cataloging worst-case scenarios for the last several minutes. "We need to move you again," she said. "I heard something outside." "Helicopters. 2, I think. Not the people you want." He went still. "How do you know that?" "Because legitimate rescue doesn't sound like that. Get up." He got up faster than she'd expected, and she revised her assessment of him again. The fatigue and the blood loss from the earlier hit were real, but underneath them was someone who had spent 14 months preparing himself psychologically for the moment the people he was documenting decided to stop tolerating him. He wasn't surprised. He was frightened, which was different. The boiler room had a second door, one she'd known about for 3 years without ever having a reason to use, that opened onto a sub-basement utility passage connecting the main building to the hospital's old east wing, a structure that had been decommissioned 7 years ago after a water damage assessment rendered 2 floors structurally compromised. The passage was dry, low-ceilinged, and completely off the grid of any building map that a person doing exterior surveillance would have consulted. She got the second door open, which required a maintenance wrench from the tool rack on the east wall applied to a bolt that hadn't been turned in years. And the door came open with a sound like a complaint. "Through here," she said. "What is this?" "Utility passage. Old east wing on the other end. Stay low. Ceiling drops about 30 meters in." He went through. She followed, pulling the door shut behind them. The passage was 40 meters of concrete and pipe insulation, lit by nothing, and she moved through it with one hand on the left wall and the other on Pruitt's shoulder, keeping him oriented. She'd walked the passage exactly once, in her first month at Hartwell General, during a facilities orientation that Gerald Poulin had conducted at a pace that suggested he found it as interesting as she did, which was to say, not very. She had memorized it anyway because that was what she did with enclosed spaces, and she had long since stopped examining the habit. They came out into the sub-basement of the east wing through a fire door that opened with a push bar, and the air changed, cooler, staler, carrying the particular smell of a space that hadn't had regular human traffic in years. Emergency lighting was absent here. The east wing had been fully decommissioned, no power of any kind. She stopped them both in the first open space, a former equipment storage room, and pulled out her phone. No signal, as expected. The wing's concrete mass ate cell transmission. She had the radio, which was now showing a battery indicator that gave her maybe 20 minutes of intermittent use. "Talk to me about Garrett Holt," she said. Pruitt was breathing harder from the passage. "What about him? Is he part of what's in that envelope?" A pause. It's complicated." "Make it simple." Pruitt pressed his back against the storage room wall. Holt didn't originate the scheme. He inherited it. When he took over the company from his father 6 years ago, the contract manipulation had already been running for 3 years. He found out about it in year 2 of his tenure, and he didn't report it. Because he was benefiting from it. Because he was afraid of the people who were running it above him. Pruitt's voice had a quality that wasn't quite defensiveness and wasn't quite self-justification. It was the sound of a man who had spent 14 months deciding what the truth actually was and was still not entirely comfortable with the conclusion. Holt's not a saint, but the operational core, the people who set this up, who have been redirecting contract funding and disposing of anyone who looked too hard at the ledgers, they're not inside Holt Meridian, they're in the oversight structure above it. She let that settle. "Give me a name." He looked at her in the darkness. "Why?" "Because I need to know whether the people in those helicopters are here to contain this, or here to clean it up, and the answer depends on who's running the oversight structure." A long pause. The boiler room door on the far side of the passage was silent. Whatever was happening in the main building hadn't reached the passage yet. Aldrich Sumner, Pruitt said. She heard the name and did not react visibly, which required a specific kind of discipline because the name landed with the weight of something she'd been carrying for a long time without knowing what shape it had. Aldrich Sumner was the Deputy Director of Defense Acquisition Oversight, a federal position that carried enormous authority over contractor compliance and almost no public profile. He was the kind of official who appeared in footnotes, who signed off on the documents that other documents referenced, who existed in the architecture of defense spending as a structural element rather than a face. She had encountered his signature in a classified file she'd reviewed in her final assignment before she'd left, in a context that had made no sense to her at the time and made complete sense now. "He buried a compliance report," she said, not quite a question. Pruitt looked at her sharply. "How do you know that?" "I wrote it," she said. The silence that followed had a texture to it, the specific quality of two people in a dark room discovering that the thing they're standing in the middle of is much larger than either of them understood, and that they're connected to it from angles they didn't know were related. Pruitt opened his mouth. She held up a hand because the radio had just transmitted again, and this time the voice was different from any she'd heard in the previous communications. It was measured, authoritative, and it came without tactical brevity. Full sentences, which meant whoever was speaking had decided they were in control of the situation now. "All elements, we have confirmation the subject is on premises. Primary objective is recovery of documentation. Secondary is containment. Collateral parameters are broad. Broad collateral parameters." She had been in enough operational briefings to know exactly what that language meant and what it authorized, and the cold she felt moving through her was not unfamiliar, but it was not something she'd expected to feel in a hospital in Del Ridge, Montana. They were authorized to harm civilians if necessary. She stood up. "How many copies of what's in that envelope?" "One," Pruitt said, then immediately, "No, 2. There's a digital copy on a drive I gave to a contact in Billings 3 weeks ago. Does your contact know what to do with it if you don't check in? He has instructions. If I miss a 72-hour check-in, it goes to a federal inspector general's office in Washington." "Which one?" "Defense Contract Oversight. A specific auditor. Someone I trust." She processed the timeline. "When was your last check-in?" He hesitated. 31 hours ago. She did the math. 41 hours remaining before the automatic trigger. If the people in the helicopters had calculated the same window, and they had, because people like Aldrich Sumner ran precise operations, then the next 41 hours was when they would apply maximum pressure on every angle they could access. "We need to get you somewhere they can't reach you and compress that timeline," she said. "Your contact in Billings, is there a way to trigger the release early?" "There's an emergency signal, a specific phrase sent from my email address." "Do you have access to your email without your phone?" "The hospital has computers. The hospital's network is currently compromised." She thought for 2 seconds. "The administration office on the second floor has a dedicated administrative server that runs on a separate subnet. It's not connected to the main hospital network. Poland set it up because he doesn't trust the main IT contractor." She'd never found that amusing until right now. "If we can get to that terminal, you can send the message." "How do we get to the second floor without going through the main building?" She looked at the ceiling. The East Wing's decommissioned second floor connected to the main building's second floor through a sealed corridor that had been closed off with drywall during the East Wing shutdown. Not structural, just drywall, which was a category of obstacles she could work with if she had the right tool. She went to the storage room's far wall and opened the cabinet she'd identified in the first 30 seconds of being in this room, because old hospital equipment storage rooms had predictable contents. And she was right. Fire axe mounted in the standard bracket, the kind of tool that building code required in every wing, regardless of operational status. Pruitt looked at the axe and then at her. "You're going to go through a wall." "I'm going to go through drywall," she said. "It's different." She took the axe from the bracket and they moved. The East Wing stairwell was intact, if dark and dusty, and they went up to the second floor without incident, the old building settling around them in the way abandoned structures settled. Small sounds, stress adjustments, nothing that indicated anything human. At the top of the stairs, she turned left, moved down the decommissioned corridor, counting door frames until she reached the point where the East Wing's second floor should, by building layout, connect to the main building's second-floor corridor. The drywall had been installed carelessly. She could see the edge of the original door frame on both sides, the drywall screwed directly into the frame without even a backing panel. It was the work of a facilities crew that wanted to finish fast and go home, and she was momentarily grateful for that particular category of human failing. 4 strikes with the flat of the axe blade, placed in the corners where the drywall was thinnest, and a section came free. She cleared the edges, checked the main building corridor through the gap, dim emergency lighting, no movement, the sound of the situation 1 floor below still distant enough to give them space, and they went through. The administrative office was 3 doors down. She got the lock with the technique that was adjacent to lockpicking and adjacent to something that shouldn't be called that, and they were inside in under a minute. The administrative terminal was a dedicated tower, mid-range hardware, running an operating system she recognized. She sat Pruitt in front of it, got it powered on. The admin network had its own UPS battery, and stepped back. "Do it fast," she said. "Send the trigger phrase and log out. Don't use any account connected to the hospital." He was already typing. His hands moved with the efficiency of someone who worked in financial systems, comfortable with keyboards, and she stood at the office door and watched the corridor while he worked. 40 seconds. Then, "It's sent." "You're certain?" "Delivery confirmed. The email client shows it went through." She felt something shift. Not relief, not yet, because the documentation reaching a federal auditor was the first move in a process that would take time she wasn't sure Pruitt had. But it was a foothold. It was something that existed outside this building and outside the control of the people in the helicopters. "Log out," she said. He logged out and stood, and as he stood, the corridor outside the administrative office went bright. Not emergency lighting bright. Full corridor lighting. The main power grid had been restored, which meant whoever had cut it had now decided that operating in darkness was no longer advantageous, or that the situation had changed enough that they wanted visibility. Both interpretations were bad. She pulled Pruitt away from the door and pressed them both against the interior wall as footsteps came down the corridor. 2 sets, moving purposefully, not searching but directing themselves toward a specific destination. They stopped outside the administrative office. She looked at Pruitt. He looked back. His breathing was controlled, but his face was not entirely. A knock on the door. 3 measured beats, not a breach, not a demand. A knock. Then a voice she did not recognize, male, calm, carrying the particular register of institutional authority rather than tactical aggression. "Ms. Vance, we know you're in there. We're not here to hurt you or your patient. We need to talk." She did not move, did not speak. She was processing the fact that they'd used her name, her current name, Nora Vance, not anything she'd used before, and parsing what that told her about how much they actually knew and what they'd had time to compile. "We have the building secured," the voice continued. "Local law enforcement has been contacted and is cooperating with our operation. You have nowhere to go that we haven't already covered. This conversation goes much better for everyone if it happens now." She heard the specific phrasing. Local law enforcement has been contacted and is cooperating, and she knew what it meant and what it cost, and she put it aside and looked at the room she was in. Administrative office. 1 door, 1 window, 2nd floor, 12-foot drop to concrete loading area below. A desk, a terminal, a filing cabinet, a landline telephone on the desk. The landline. Administrative subnet, Poulin's separate infrastructure, not connected to the main hospital network. If the main hospital network had been compromised from the moment the tactical team entered the building, then the admin landline ran on a circuit that had never been touched. She was across the room in 3 steps. She picked up the handset. Dial tone, clean, strong, the specific sound of a line that has not been interfered with. She dialed from memory. A number she had not used in 4 years, that she had not called once since arriving in Delridge, that she had kept in her head the way you keep things you tell yourself you'll never need. 3 rings. Then, "Yeah." 1 word and she knew the voice. "It's Vance," she said. A pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds. Where? Delridge, Montana. Hartwell General Medical Center. I have a civilian with documentation connecting a federal official to a contractor fraud operation worth several $100 million in defense funds. There is a unit on site using broad collateral authorization. The name is Aldrich Sumner. Another pause. Longer. She heard something in the background, a chair moving, a door. Say that name again. She said it again. How long have you been sitting on this? I haven't been sitting on it. It walked into my hospital 3 hours ago. She paused. I need someone who isn't connected to this operation. I need someone who can get here without going through channels Sumner controls. You're asking me to move outside the coordination structure. I'm asking you to move, she said. There's a difference. The longest pause yet. She was aware, at the edges of her attention, that the man in the corridor had stopped speaking and that the silence outside the door had the quality of people conferring rather than withdrawing. I can have someone to you in 40 minutes, the voice said. 40 minutes is long. It's the best I can do from this position without triggering flags that will get back to the people you're describing. You understand what I'm asking you to do for 40 minutes? She understood exactly. Yes. Is there anything else I should know? She looked at Pruitt, who was watching her with the focused expression of a man trying to understand a conversation from one side of it. She looked at the door. She looked at the window and the drop below it. And she made a calculation that was partly tactical and partly the kind of assessment that required knowing your own limits and being honest about them. There's a patient on the ground floor, she said. Gunshot wound, right hemothorax, stable as of 40 minutes ago. He needs monitoring. If the people out there are any kind of professional, they won't touch him, but I need someone to know he's there. Got it. 40 minutes, Vance. Don't do anything I'd have to explain afterward. She hung up. The knock on the door came again, harder this time, and the calm voice had acquired an edge. Ms. Vance, last opportunity before we open this door ourselves. She looked at Pruitt. Give me the envelope. He hesitated for half a second, then handed it over. She tucked it inside her scrub top against her left side, where it sat flat and was not visible from the exterior. She handed him the radio. If I get separated from you, use this. Press transmit 3 times without speaking. Someone will hear it. She held his eyes. Don't open that door. Don't answer them. I'll be back. Where are you going? She was already at the window, assessing the drop. 12 feet to concrete was not a survivable drop at a bad angle. At the right angle, landing correctly, absorbing through the knees and rolling immediately rather than resisting the impact, it was uncomfortable and possibly involved a twisted ankle and definitely involved pain that she would have to manage later when there was a later to manage it in. She opened the window. Hey, Pruitt said. She went over the sill feet first and dropped. The concrete came up fast. She landed, rolled, came up on one knee on the loading area surface, and took stock of herself. Right ankle had compressed harder than ideal. Not broken, functional. She would feel it for a week if she lived that long. She was upright in under 2 seconds. The loading area was at the south side of the building, empty, lit by the restored exterior lights. She heard voices from the north, the helicopter crews, she assumed, or the exterior security element, and she went opposite, moving east along the building's exterior. She needed to get back inside without going through any entrance that was currently monitored, which meant she needed the east wing. The passage she'd used earlier was compromised if they'd found the boiler room door. The east wing's exterior had 3 ground-level windows on the south-facing wall, all of them decommissioned but not sealed. She reached the first one, found it painted shut, moved to the second, and this one gave with pressure applied at the lower left corner where the paint seal had cracked from seasonal temperature shifts. She got it open, went through, dropped into the empty room on the other side. She was in the east wing's ground floor. She oriented herself. The passage to the main building was behind her. Ahead was the east wing's decommissioned north corridor, and at the far end of that corridor, if the building blueprints in her memory were accurate, was a janitor's access stairwell that came out in the main building's ground floor, specifically in the supply corridor adjacent to the ER intake area. She started moving. The envelope was flat against her ribs, and she could feel it with every step, and she kept moving because the alternative to moving was allowing 40 minutes to elapse without any control over what happened in them, and she had not spent 11 years in situations where everything was trying to kill her in order to stand still in a decommissioned hospital wing and wait. The north corridor was dark and long, and she moved through it without light. her hand on the right wall counting door frames, and she was at the junction to the janitor's access stairwell when she heard something ahead of her. Not movement, not footsteps. A voice, coming from the stairwell access, low and terse, and then a second voice responding, and she recognized the first voice from the corridor outside the administrative office. The calm, authoritative voice that had knocked on the door and said her name. She stopped. There were people in the stairwell directly ahead of her, between her current position and the main building's ground floor, and she heard enough of the conversation to understand that they weren't a search team. They were a decision team, two people conferring about a situation that had become complicated, and the specific complication they were discussing was what to do about the documentation that had been sent from the administrative terminal. The transmission went through, the first voice said. We can't unsend it. We know the destination? A different voice, male, older, with the particular flatness of someone accustomed to hearing bad news and processing it without showing the processing. Working on it, but if it's where we think it is, we have a window problem. How long? Unknown, could be hours, could trigger automatically. A pause. Then we shift to damage control. The nurse becomes the story. She stayed absolutely still. Frame it how? Disgruntled former military, unstable. She interfered with a federal operation and endangered the patient she was supposedly protecting. We have the file from her service record. The parts that weren't classified will do the work we need. What about the local witnesses? The security guard's call went through a compromised dispatch line. We control what his statement says he reported. The doctor is manageable. The tech upstairs hasn't seen enough to create problems. She was hearing the architecture of her own destruction being assembled in real time, in a stairwell in a decommissioned wing of a rural Montana hospital, by people who had decided she was easier to erase than to address. She stood in the dark, and she listened, and she kept her breathing even, and she did not move, and she memorized every word. And Pruitt? He's not operational without the documentation. The physical copy is already... A radio burst interrupted. A transmission, sharp and urgent, from whoever was running the exterior element. Then the older voice said something she didn't expect to hear, said it in a tone that changed the shape of everything she thought she understood about who was actually in this building tonight. He said, "Tell them to stand down. We have a problem." And then, from outside the building, from the direction of the highway, not the direction of the two helicopters already on the ground, a sound she had not permitted herself to hope for in the last 40 minutes. A third aircraft. Different engine signature, different approach angle, flying with lights on, full exterior illumination, the specific configuration of an aircraft that wanted to be visible, that was announcing itself to everyone in the vicinity with deliberate and unmistakable clarity. The two men in the stairwell ahead of her went quiet. She heard one of them key a radio. "Who authorized the third bird?" he said. The response came back through the radio with the clean authority of someone who was not asking permission from anyone in this building. "This is Special Agent Rosalind Kay, Defense Criminal Investigative Service. All elements on this property are ordered to stand down and hold position. This operation is now under federal oversight jurisdiction. Anyone who does not comply in the next 60 seconds will be detained." The stairwell ahead of her was silent. Then the older voice said very quietly to the man beside him, something that was not for any radio and was not for any record. 3 words that she heard clearly through the thin partition of a decommissioned corridor wall, 3 words that told her exactly how deep this went and exactly how much it mattered that the third helicopter had arrived with its lights on. He said, "Sumner should have known." And somewhere in the building above her, she heard someone begin to run. The footsteps running above her were heavy and heading north, and she gave herself exactly 3 seconds to decide what to do about it before the decision made itself. She went up the stairwell. The 2 men who'd been conferring in the passage ahead of her had separated. She could hear one of them moving toward the building's exterior through the east wing, the other static, possibly calling something in on a radio. Neither of them had come her direction, which meant they hadn't heard her in the corridor, or they'd heard her and decided the third aircraft changed their priorities entirely. Either way, she had a lane and she took it, pushing through the stairwell door and going up to the main building's ground floor, emerging into the supply corridor just as the ER intake area flooded with a different quality of motion. These were not the tactical team. The tactical team moved with suppressed urgency, controlled, tight, vectored. What she was seeing through the intake area windows was the opposite. People coming in through the main entrance with the particular organized speed of a unit that had the authority to be loud about it. 4 agents in dark jackets with clearly visible identification, 2 in tactical gear that was clean and marked, and at the center of the formation, a woman in her mid-40s moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been in enough buildings at 2 in the morning to find it unremarkable. Special Agent Rosalind Kay was shorter than her radio voice suggested, with gray threading through dark hair that she hadn't bothered to manage, and the kind of stillness in her face that came from long practice at absorbing information without telegraphing a response to it. She had a tablet in her left hand, and she was reading from it even as she walked, which was either multitasking or a performance of composure, and from what Nora could see through the window glass, it was the former. Nora pushed through the corridor door into the intake area. 2 of the agents turned and had hands on sidearms before she'd taken a second step. "Nora Vance," she said evenly. "Night shift nurse. I called in the federal asset flag through a security guard approximately 40 minutes ago. I have documentation on my person connected to this operation and a civilian witness secured on the 2nd floor." Kay had looked up from the tablet during the first sentence. She looked at Nora now with the particular attention of someone cataloging what they were seeing against what they'd been told to expect. And the match was apparently close enough because she made a small gesture and the 2 agents eased their hands away from their weapons. "Where's the witness?" Kay said. "Administrative office, 2nd floor. I told him not to open the door for anyone who didn't know a specific phrase." Nora paused. "I'll need to go up with you. You'll need to be checked first." "I know." She put her hands out, palms up, the specific posture of someone who has done this before and finds it neither insulting nor particularly significant. One of the agents did a quick professional search, found the radio, found the envelope inside her scrub top, which she'd expected, and which required a brief explanation. "That stays with me until I hand it to you personally," she said to Kay. Kay looked at the envelope and then at her. "You're not in a position to negotiate evidence custody." "I'm not negotiating. I'm telling you what's going to happen so we don't have a conversation about it later. That envelope goes from my hands to yours. No intermediary. Because the last time documentation from this operation passed through an intermediary, it got buried by a deputy director." A beat. Something moved in Kay's expression that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite recognition. It was the look of a person who has been building a case from one angle and has just been handed a detail that connects to a different angle they hadn't fully closed. "How do you know about the buried report?" Kay said. "I wrote it," Nora said, 4 years ago. From the same operation, different entry point. Aldrich Sumner had it classified and my service record annotated to suggest I was unreliable." The intake area was quiet enough that the fluorescent hum was audible. The 2 agents who'd checked her were looking at Kay. Kay was looking at Nora. "Come with me," Kay said. They went up. Pruitt opened the administrative office door when Nora gave the phrase. He'd been listening for footsteps and voices and had heard enough of the radio announcement to know the shape of what had changed, but he was still tight-shouldered and pale, the kind of pale that was partly sustained stress and partly the delayed physiological response to a night that had demanded more than most people were ever asked to sustain. He looked at Kay and the agents behind her and then at Nora, and Nora gave him a nod that was small and direct, and he exhaled something he'd apparently been holding since the boiler room. Nora handed the envelope to Kay, not to an agent, directly to Kay, watching her take it, watching her open it, and look at the first several pages with the focused attention of someone reading something they'd been expecting to find but hadn't known the exact form of. "This is original documentation," Kay said to Pruitt. "Originals and certified copies. The originals I pulled from the Financial Compliance Archive before Patton's team locked the system. The copies I made independently and stored off-site." He cleared his throat. "There's also a digital set. I sent the trigger an hour ago. The recipient should have it by now." "Who's the recipient?" Pruitt gave a name and an office designation in Washington. Kay processed it, made a note on her tablet. "We'll need to coordinate with that office, but this—" She looked at the pages again. "This is enough to move on." "Move on Sumner specifically?" Nora said. "Move on the structure." Kay was choosing her words with precision. "Sumner is part of it. He's not all of it." What's the rest of it? Kay closed the envelope. Miss Vance, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it carefully. She looked up. The unit that entered this building tonight, you identified them by a specific communication signal. How do you know that signal? The room was quiet. Nora could hear one of the agents shifting weight in the corridor outside. I was briefed on that unit's operational signature in a classified context 4 years ago, she said. In conjunction with the report I mentioned, part of what I uncovered before the report was buried was that the unit existed and who had authorized its domestic deployment. She paused. That's also in the report. In the final 3 pages, which I suspect were the first pages Sumner removed. Kay set the envelope on the desk and turned to the last section of documents. Found the final pages. Read for 90 seconds without expression, then set the pages down in a specific, careful way that communicated more than any expression would have. The unit's domestic authorization traces to a standing order issued from the Deputy Director's office, Nora said. The order has been renewed every 18 months for the past 6 years. Each renewal requires a signatory from within the Oversight Committee. The signatory is always the same. Sumner, Kay said. Sumner. Kay was quiet for a moment, then she looked at Pruitt. I need you to come with my team. We're going to take a formal statement tonight while the details are current. That's not optional. I know, Pruitt said. I know. He sounded tired in the specific way that people sounded when they'd been holding something up for a long time and had finally been allowed to put it down. But the muscles hadn't yet understood they could relax. One of the agents let him out. The corridor outside had more motion now. Kay's team had fanned through the building, and the radio traffic coming through her earpiece was steady and controlled and clearly being managed. Kay turned back to Nora. The people who entered this building tonight, Nora said, 2 of them were in the East Wing decommissioned corridor when your aircraft arrived. One of them used specific language about the operation that I need to give you verbatim while it's current. Go, Kay said, and Nora gave her the conversation she'd overheard in the passage. The frame job being constructed against her, the phrase about controlling Galter's dispatch record, the instruction to make her the story. She delivered it in sequence, without editorializing, the way she'd learned to deliver field reports, and Kay recorded it on the tablet and did not interrupt once. When she finished, Kay said, You understand what you just described as attempted evidence suppression and conspiracy to provide false information in a federal proceeding? Yes. And you have no recording of it. No recording, witness testimony mine, she paused. Which was the point of framing me as unstable. A witness who's been characterized as unreliable can't testify effectively against a deputy director. That's correct, Kay said, which is why the next thing you're going to do is write down exactly what you heard, in your own handwriting, before this night gets any older. She produced a legal pad from somewhere that suggested she'd come prepared for exactly this kind of conversation, and set it on the desk in front of Nora. Nora sat down and wrote. It took 11 minutes. She wrote everything she'd heard in the passage, every word she was confident of in quotation marks, and the paraphrased portions clearly marked as such, with a note at the top giving the approximate time, her position relative to the speakers, and the acoustic conditions. It was the most precise document she'd produced in 3 years, and she did it without stopping to second-guess herself because second-guessing served no purpose when what she'd heard was what she'd heard. She handed it to Kay. Kay read it, made 2 annotations in the margins, and put it with the envelope. Where's the security guard? Nora said. Found him in the maintenance office on the south side. He's fine. He's angry. That sounds right. She paused. The cardiac patient in bed 3 on the ground floor. He's been checked, and he's stable. Your Dr. Fasano is with him. Kay looked at her for a moment. You want to check yourself? Yes. Go. I'll find you before we leave. Nora left the administrative office and went down to the ground floor and found the overnight ward. The cardiac patient, his name was Roy Ellenbeck. She'd known that since night 2 of his admission, but had only used it when she needed to, was awake, propped up on his pillows, watching the controlled chaos of the hallway through the window in his room door with the expression of a man who had been through enough in his 72 years to find even an armed incursion into a hospital mostly interesting rather than terrifying. She pushed the door open and came in and checked his monitors. His rhythm was stable. His pressure was good. He looked at her. "You look like you've had a rough night," he said. "You could say that." "What happened out there? Those weren't regular police." "Federal agents," she said, adjusting his IV drip by a small amount that the number on the pump had been telling her to adjust for the last hour. "Something bigger than Del Ridge got into the building tonight. It's handled." "You handled it?" She looked at the monitor readout, not at him. "A lot of people handled it. That security guard with the gray mustache was talking to one of those agents outside. He kept pointing back this way." The old man paused. "He was pointing at you, I think, when he described whoever it was he was talking about." She made a note on Roy Ellenbeck's chart. "Get some sleep. I'm 72 years old in a hospital at 3 in the morning after armed people came through the building," he said. "I'm not sleeping." She almost said something and didn't, and she left him to his wakefulness because he had earned it. Marco Fasano was in the corridor, leaning against the wall outside Bay 2 with his arms crossed and a look on his face that had components she didn't have time to fully parse. He'd been a physician long enough that his baseline expression was a kind of professional calm, but underneath it tonight was something that wanted to ask questions and had been holding them since approximately 2:13 a.m. "Brannon," she said. "Stable. They've got a thoracic consult coming in from Billings on a federal transport." He paused. "Nora." "I know. You want to tell me what happened tonight?" She looked at him. Marco Fasano was 46, divorced, had come to Del Ridge from a trauma fellowship at a Level 1 center in Seattle because he'd grown up in rural Montana and missed it in a way that surprised him, and he was a better physician than the posting required. He was also, she'd decided in the first 6 months of working alongside him, a fundamentally honest person, which was a quality she'd learned not to take for granted. "Some of it," she said, "some of it I can't say yet." He nodded. He didn't push. She had expected him to push, and he didn't, and the not pushing was its own kind of acknowledgement. Of the night, of her, of the specific category of situation that didn't come with a clean debrief. "You made the right calls," he said, "all night. Everything you did medically and whatever the rest of it was." He uncrossed his arms. "I want you to know I'm going to say that to whoever asks." "They'll ask," she said. "I figured." She moved on. The ER intake area had been converted into a temporary field coordination point. Kay's team had set up a portable communication station where the intake desk had been, and 3 agents were working through documentation and radio traffic and the logistics of an operation that had shifted from response to investigation in the span of 40 minutes. The 6 tactical operators who'd entered the building at 2:13 a.m. were seated in a row along the far wall, flex-cuffed, weapons secured, not speaking. 2 of them looked like the night had not gone as briefed. The other 4 had the particular blank expression of people waiting to be processed. Garrett Holt was in a separate corner, seated across a portable folding table from an agent Nora hadn't seen before. Young, precise, taking notes with a physical pen on a physical pad in a way that suggested everything in this conversation was being handled with enough caution that no one trusted digital recording yet. Holt was talking. He'd been talking for some time from the look of it. His expensive jacket was off, folded over the back of his chair, and he had the diminished look of a man whose confidence came from context, and whose context had been thoroughly removed. He saw Nora when she came through the corridor door. Their eyes met across the intake area. He held her gaze for a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then he looked away, and then, as though something had decided for him, he looked back. "Miss Vance," he said, loudly enough to carry across the room. The agent taking notes looked up. The agents near the communication station looked over. Nora stopped walking. "I said something to you when you came in tonight," Holt said, "about wanting a real doctor." She waited. "I was wrong," he said. "That's all. I needed to say that directly." It wasn't an eloquent statement. It didn't have the crafted quality of something he'd prepared. It had the slightly ragged quality of a man who had been sitting in a plastic chair processing a night that had dismantled several things he thought he understood about the world, and had arrived at a small truth he felt compelled to deliver, even with federal agents in the room and his own future under active legal review. She looked at him for a moment. "Your man is going to be fine," she said. "Make sure he gets the thoracic follow-up." She walked on. The east corridor was quieter. She found an empty supply alcove and leaned against the wall inside it, and let herself be still for the first time since 1:55 a.m. Her right ankle was complaining in the specific way that an injury complains when adrenaline stops managing it, a deep throb that pulsed with her heartbeat. She was going to need to look at it in about an hour, and she was going to be deeply unhappy with what she found. Her hands were steady, which was the thing she'd always been most grateful for. Whatever happened internally in high-stakes situations, her hands stayed steady, which was either a gift or a particular kind of emotional suppression that she'd chosen not to examine too carefully over the years. She thought about Aldrich Sumner. She thought about him sitting in whatever office he occupied at whatever time Washington currently was. It was not yet 4 a.m. in Montana, which meant not yet 6 a.m. on the East Coast, and whether he knew yet that the third helicopter had landed, whether someone in his network had called him, whether he was the kind of man who woke easily or the kind who slept through the early hours and arrived at his desk calm and unaware, and what his face would do when his phone rang with the news that his operation in Delridge had not gone as planned. She had testified in classified proceedings before. She knew what the process looked like, and how long it took, and how much it cost the person doing the testifying, even when they were right, even when the evidence was clean, even when the investigative body was legitimate. Justice at the level Sumner occupied moved the way large things moved, slowly at first, with tremendous resistance from every direction, and then in a way that could not be stopped once enough mass had committed to the direction. The mass was committing now. She'd felt it in the way Kay had read those last pages. She'd felt it in the careful way the agent had taken notes on Holt's statement. She'd felt it in the fact that Pruitt's email had gone through and was sitting in an inspector general's inbox in Washington, and that the 41-hour window had been compressed to something much smaller, and that there were now multiple federal agents in a Montana hospital who had heard, directly, the specific name she'd given Kay in the intake area. The supply alcove had a small mirror on the wall above the sink, the kind they put in every supply room, so nurses could check themselves before patient interactions. She looked at herself in it and looked away. She looked tired, and she knew she was tired, and looking at it didn't change anything, and she went back to the corridor. Kay found her 20 minutes later, near the East Corridor junction, sitting on a waiting room chair that someone had placed in the hallway at some point in the last year for reasons no one had documented. "We're taking the tactical team to the county detention facility in Morrow," Kay said. The two individuals from the East Wing passage were apprehended on the building's exterior. Both of them? One tried to get to the vehicle staging area on Route 12. Our ground team had it covered. Nora absorbed this. And Sumner? Kay sat in the chair against the opposite wall, which was the specific posture of a senior agent who was about to say something they'd calculated the wording of. At this moment, there are agents at the residence of Deputy Director Aldrich Sumner, with a federal warrant issued 40 minutes ago by a duty judge in Washington. The warrant is based on the documentation from Pruitt's envelope and 3 additional evidentiary threads that the DCIS has been developing for the last 7 months. 7 months. She'd been in Delridge for 3 years, and in Washington there had been an investigation running for 7 months that had been building toward the same point she'd been building toward in the final year of her service. And neither had known about the other, and tonight both had arrived at the same hospital in the same small Montana town because a financial compliance officer had gotten into a black Suburban and been shot on a rural highway. "Your compliance report," Kay said, "the one from 4 years ago. We found reference to it in our investigation. A redacted summary in a file that shouldn't have existed. We've been trying to identify the original author for 5 months. Nora looked at her. "The annotation on your service record," Kay continued, "the unreliability notation. We identified it as a flag pattern consistent with witness suppression about 8 weeks ago. We didn't have a name attached to the original record." She paused. "We have it now." "Who put the notation on my record?" "A personnel officer who processed the file received direction from the deputy director's office. We have the email chain." Kay's voice was even, professional, and underneath both of those things was the specific quality of someone delivering information they know has weight. "Your record can be formally reviewed and corrected through a process that begins with your testimony. It's not fast and it's not simple, but it's available." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I didn't leave because of the notation," she said. "I left because I understood what it meant about the institution, and I didn't know how to stay inside an institution I no longer trusted. I understand that, Kay said, not reflexively, with the quality of a person who actually understood it. What happens next? Nora said. Tonight, statements, evidence processing, chain of custody documentation. Tomorrow, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington takes primary jurisdiction. Sumner will be in federal custody within the next 2 hours. The tactical operators will be processed for conspiracy and federal assault charges. Kay looked at her pad. The two individuals from the East Wing passage are the ones I'm most interested in because of what you overheard. Their statements are going to be significant. They'll lawyer up. Yes, but 2 of the tactical operators have already indicated willingness to cooperate. When people understand the relative weight of what they're facing against what cooperation offers, the calculus changes quickly. She paused. Especially when the man at the top is already in custody and therefore can't protect anyone. The corridor was quiet enough that Nora could hear the distant sound of Roy Ellenbeck's monitor through the closed ward door. Steady, even. The sound of a heart that had been frightened and was still going. I need to tell you something, Kay said, and her tone shifted slightly, becoming careful in a new way. We've been thorough in building this case, and we've been thorough about everyone connected to it. She looked at Nora directly. We know who you called tonight, the number you used from the administrative office landline. Nora said nothing. The person you called has a history with the operations adjacent to this case. He's known to our investigation, not as a subject, as a peripheral contact of Sumner's from a different direction, in a context that predates your call tonight by several years. Kay paused. We're not suggesting you had any knowledge of that connection, but we need to talk about it. She thought about the voice on the other end of the administrative office line. The 2-second pause after she'd said her name. The way he'd asked her to repeat Sumner's name, not because he hadn't heard it, but because he was deciding something in the moment of the asking. She'd trusted him because she'd known him in a context that had felt clean, and in this business, contexts that felt clean had a way of being more complicated than they appeared, and she was sitting in a hospital hallway at 3:40 in the morning, understanding that the person who had gotten Rosalind Kay here in 40 minutes might have done it for reasons that were adjacent to helping her and also adjacent to something else entirely. What kind of connection? She said. Kay opened her mouth to answer. The main entrance doors opened and 2 more agents came through, escorting a man in a gray suit who was not handcuffed but was clearly not there by his own decision. He was in his 60s, heavy set, with the coloring of someone whose blood pressure was currently doing something dramatic, and he had the stunned expression of a man who had been woken from sleep and driven to a hospital in Montana and had not yet assembled a response to any of it. Nora had never seen his face in person. She recognized it anyway. From documents. From the signature at the bottom of 3 compliance renewals she'd found in a file she wasn't supposed to access. In the final weeks of her final assignment, before the report she'd written had disappeared into a classification level that shouldn't have been able to reach it. Aldrich Sumner looked around the intake area with the expression of a man cataloging damage. His eyes landed on Nora. She watched his face move through something. Recognition, she thought, though they'd never met. And then through something else that took her a moment to identify, because it wasn't what she expected. It wasn't contempt. It wasn't the cold authority of someone accustomed to making people's problems disappear. It was the particular look of a man who has just understood the exact shape of the thing that destroyed him, and the shape is not what he expected it to be. He hadn't expected a night shift nurse. The agent on Sumner's left directed him toward the folding table, and Kay stood and moved toward the intake area, and the intake area became the kind of organized, controlled space that federal proceedings turned rooms into, and Nora stayed in the hallway chair and watched through the corridor window. Then Sumner said something to the agent on his left. A request, it looked like, a directed question. And the agent looked toward the corridor window and toward Nora, and Sumner followed the agent's gaze, and for a second time in less than a minute, Aldrich Sumner was looking directly at her. He said something. From this distance, through the window, she couldn't hear it, but she could read it. She'd been trained to read lips in a context so different from this hallway that thinking about it felt like thinking about another person's life. 2 words. He said, "She's her." And then Kay stepped between them and the angle closed, and through the window Nora could see the folding table and the agents and the evidence bags being brought in from outside. And she could see Garrett Holt in his corner still talking to the note-taking agent, and she could see Pruitt at a second table with two different agents, his empty hands resting on the table surface, the envelope finally somewhere other than his arms. She looked at all of it. Then she thought about what Kay had said about the person she'd called, the peripheral connection, the history with the adjacent operations. She pulled the number up in her recent call log and looked at it for a long moment and put her phone away. Something was still wrong. She could feel it the way she'd felt the footsteps in the parking structure at 1:55 a.m. Not with certainty, not with detail, but with the specific awareness of a pattern that didn't resolve the way patterns should resolve when everything was actually finished. The third helicopter had arrived at the right time. The warrant had been issued 40 minutes after Galter's call went through. The tactical operators were in custody, and the evidence was in Kay's hands, and Sumner was sitting at a folding table in a hospital intake area with agents on both sides of him. And none of it explained why the person she'd called had answered on the second ring. She had called a number she hadn't used in 4 years. She'd expected it to take time for the number to route, time for whoever was on the other end to understand who was calling, time for the calculation about whether to respond. A number she hadn't used in 4 years should have required time. People moved, they changed numbers, they changed roles, they changed the degree to which they wanted to be reachable. 2 rings. As if the line had been open and waiting for someone to dial it. She stood up from the hallway chair and went looking for Rosalind Kay, because there was a conversation they hadn't finished, and the part they hadn't finished was the part that mattered most. And she needed to have it before another hour passed and the shape of the night hardened into something that would be much harder to revise. She found Kay near the portable communication station, reviewing something on the tablet with one of the field agents, and she waited until the agent stepped away before she spoke. "The number I called tonight," she said. "Tell me the connection." Kay looked at her, read her face, put the tablet down. "Walk with me," she said. They went into the east corridor far enough from the intake area that the ambient noise of the operation dropped to a manageable level, and Kay turned to face her with the expression of someone who had decided that a clean answer was less costly than a careful one. "The number traces to a man named Warren Doyle," Kay said. "Former Defense Intelligence officer, retired 4 years ago under circumstances that were officially categorized as voluntary separation. Unofficially, he was pushed out during a restructuring that Sumner's office influenced directly. He's been operating as a private security consultant since then." "I know who he is," Nora said. "I knew him inside. He was the one who told me to write the compliance report in the first place. He's the reason I knew what to look for." "I understand that," Kay said. "What you may not know is that Doyle has been in contact with our investigation. Not as a witness, not as a subject, as a source. For 5 months, he's been providing information about Sumner's network from the outside. Things he had access to through his consulting work, former colleagues still inside the structure. He's been building toward the same destination you and Pruitt were building toward, from a completely different direction." Nora absorbed this. "He knew I was here?" Kay hesitated for exactly the length of time it takes a careful person to decide how much of a careful answer is warranted. 3 weeks ago, Doyle told us he believed there was a former service member connected to the original buried report who might still have relevant knowledge. He didn't have a name or a location. He had a description of the report's contents and an inference about the author's profile. She paused. "When you called his number tonight, he called our duty officer within 4 minutes. He told us what you'd told him, and he told us to move." "He was waiting," Nora said. "Not an accusation. A piece of the pattern clicking into its correct position. He'd been waiting for something to break the situation loose for months. He didn't know it was going to be tonight or in Delridge, but he was ready." Kay looked at her steadily. "I want to be clear. His contact with our investigation doesn't make him suspect. He cooperated with us precisely because he couldn't trust the internal channels, which is the same reason you left the service when you did. You were both responding to the same institutional failure." Nora was quiet for a moment. She thought about Warren Doyle answering on the second ring. She thought about the 2-second pause when she'd said her name. She thought about the way he'd said, "Tell me the name again," Sumner's name. Not because he hadn't heard it, but because he was calculating, in the space of 2 seconds, how to move a piece he'd been holding in reserve for 5 months. He hadn't told her he was connected to an active investigation. He hadn't told her he was positioned to accelerate what she'd triggered. He'd just said 40 minutes and moved. She wasn't sure if she was angry about that. She looked at the feeling from several angles and found that it was complicated in the way that most things involving people she trusted were complicated, which was to say, it had layers, and she didn't have the energy to work through all of them at 4 in the morning. "Is he going to be required to testify?" she said. "He's already agreed to it. And his cooperation, does that change his standing with the restructuring, the record of his separation?" Kay paused. "That's a process that requires formal review. It's not something I can promise outcomes on. I'm not asking for a promise. I'm asking whether the process exists." "It exists," Kay said. "The same process that applies to your record." Nora nodded once. "Then I'll testify to everything I know, starting with the report I wrote 4 years ago and ending with what I heard in that passage tonight. I'm going to need that in writing before you leave this building." "I know. Give me the pad." Kay gave her a second legal pad, and Nora took it back to the hallway chair and wrote for the better part of an hour, filling pages in the compact, precise handwriting she'd developed during years of producing field documentation that had to be legible under conditions that weren't conducive to good penmanship. She wrote the original report's substance from memory. She had never forgotten it. Not a figure, not a name, not a date. And she wrote everything that had happened from 12:40 a.m. until the current moment. And when she reached the end of what there was to write, her right hand had a cramp in the web of muscle below the thumb that she worked out slowly with her left hand while the early morning light began finding the edges of the corridor windows. It was coming up on 5:30. She'd been on shift since 11 the previous evening. In the normal sequence of events, she would have been home by 7, asleep by 7:30. The normal sequence of events had not applied tonight, and somewhere in the back of her mind, the part that managed basic physiological maintenance was making notes about what was going to be required of her in the next 12 hours simply to stay functional. She took the completed pages to Kay, who was still working, and handed them over. Kay looked at the volume of writing. "All of this from memory?" "Yes. You're going to need to verify this against whatever documents we can recover from the classified archive. That process will take months." "I know. And you'll need legal representation before the formal testimony stage." "I know that too." Kay looked at her with the expression of someone preparing to say something they hadn't fully scripted. "Ms. Vance, the notation on your service record, the unreliability flag, I looked at it tonight while you were writing. The actual documentation." She paused. "It's thin. Whoever constructed it did it quickly and relied on the classification level to keep it from being examined. The moment a review board looks at it with the context of what we now have, it doesn't hold." Nora felt something move through her that wasn't relief yet. It was the precursor to relief. The sensation of a weight that had been so constant she'd stopped registering it as weight beginning, just slightly, to shift. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Kay nodded. Professional, but not cold. The morning moved forward in the way mornings after long nights moved. Not quickly, but with a gathering momentum as the people in the building finished their immediate tasks, and the operation shifted from field response to institutional process. Sumner had been formally arrested and transported before 5 a.m., flanked by 2 agents who had the particular focus of people managing a high-profile custody with no tolerance for procedural error. He had not said anything further after the moment at the folding table. His attorney had been called from the vehicle on the way out, and whatever conversation followed was no longer Nora's to observe. The 6 tactical operators had been processed and transported to the county facility in Morrow. The 2 from the East Wing passage were being treated as separate cases given the nature of what Nora had overheard, and the agent managing their documentation had the careful, deliberate manner of someone building something that needed to survive a chain of legal challenges. Garrett Holt left the building at 5:15 with his remaining suited aide. His attorney was presumably already on a phone somewhere. He paused near the entrance and looked back toward the corridor where Nora was standing, and she saw him start to say something and then think better of it, and then leave. She didn't know what he'd intended to say. It didn't particularly matter. The conversation they'd had in the intake area at 4 a.m. had been the conversation that mattered, and it had been short and direct and as close to honest as a man in his position was capable of being under the circumstances, and she was willing to accept that as sufficient. Daniel Pruitt was the last of the civilians to leave. He came through the corridor at 5:20 with an agent on either side and a second set of Kay's people carrying the evidence from his envelope in sealed bags, and he stopped when he saw Nora. He looked different than he had in the boiler room or the administrative office. Not better, exactly. He was still exhausted, still had the cut above his brow, still carried the residual tension of someone who had spent 14 months afraid, but the fear had a different quality now. It was moving through him rather than residing in him, which was a different experience entirely. "I didn't ask your name," he said. "When you came into the bay, I didn't ask it." "Nora Vance." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you going to be all right?" It was such a specific question that she had to take a second with it. People in crisis scenarios, once the scenario resolved, tended to collapse inward, to become focused on their own next steps, their own safety, their own requirements. Pruitt was doing the opposite, which told her something about who he actually was underneath the 14 months of sustained fear. "I'll be all right," she said. "What you did tonight," he started. "You did it too," she said. "You collected the documentation. You got into the vehicle. You sat in a hospital bay holding an envelope while armed people searched the building. That's not nothing." He looked like he wanted to dispute this and couldn't quite find the argument. He nodded once, and the agent on his left touched his elbow gently, and he went. The building emptied gradually. Kay's team wrapped the portable communication station and loaded the equipment. The flex cuffs from the tactical team's processing had been collected from the intake area floor. Someone had, at some point, repaired or reset the entrance doors because they were functioning again, no longer blown off their hinges, just doors, doing what doors did. Marco Fasano found her in the supply alcove at 6:15, sitting on an overturned crate with her right shoe off, examining her ankle. He looked at it. "That's not good. It's not broken." "It's not broken either." He crouched, ran his hands along the bone with the automatic assessment of a physician who can't turn the reflex off. And she let him, because refusing would have been a performance of toughness she didn't have the energy for. Probably a grade 2 sprain, maybe a small avulsion fracture on the lateral malleolus we'd need imaging to confirm. "You need to stay off it." "I will." "When?" "When the paperwork's done." He sat back on his heels and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been a doctor long enough to know exactly what that answer meant and exactly how much influence he had over it, which was zero. "What happened tonight, Nora? And I mean, what actually happened?" She looked at him. She thought about how much to say and what form to say it in, and she thought about what he'd said in the corridor earlier. "I want you to know I'm going to say that to whoever asks," and she decided he deserved something real. "A long time ago I was in a different job," she said. "I found out some people in positions of authority were doing something that was going to cost a lot of money that belonged to the public, and was going to make a small number of people very secure and a large number of people considerably less safe. I tried to report it through the right channels, and the right channels were controlled by the wrong people. So I left, and I ended up here. That's the short version. That's the short version. What's the long version? The long version is what those agents are going to spend the next several months processing." She looked at her ankle and put her shoe back on. "The short version is that tonight the people who buried the report I wrote 4 years ago are going to be charged with federal crimes, and the charges are going to stick, and the record that was used to discredit me is going to be formally reviewed and corrected." Fasano was quiet for a moment. "And in the meantime," he said, "you've been here, putting in IVs and adjusting drips and sitting with Roy Ellenbeck at 2 in the morning because he's scared. Someone has to." "Yeah," he paused. "Yeah, they do." He stood up and brushed dust from his scrubbed knees, in the way people brush things from their knees when they were finishing one kind of conversation and didn't quite know how to start the next one. "For what it's worth, I never thought you were just a nurse. I mean, I knew you were good at it, but I always thought there was something else there." "Most people did," she said. "They just didn't ask." I should have asked. You should have, she said, and there was nothing pointed in it, just an honest agreement between two people who had spent 3 years being professionally correct with each other, and were now, in a supply alcove at 6 in the morning, doing something slightly different. The formal process of the following weeks was not clean. Nothing involving federal oversight proceedings and service record reviews and multi-agency coordination was ever clean, and Nora had been in enough institutions to know that the gap between what should happen and what actually happened was almost always filled with delay, procedural friction, and the specific exhaustion of being a person who needed the process to work and was required to be patient while it did so at its own pace. She testified twice in the first month, once in a recorded statement to the DCIS team that Kay led, and once in a sealed proceeding before a federal grand jury in Washington that she flew to on a Tuesday and returned from on a Thursday, and which she could not discuss with anyone in Delridge because the proceeding was sealed and the rules were the rules. Gerald Poulin gave her the days off without asking why, and she was obscurely grateful for that. And when she returned, she came back on shift on the Friday night and treated a farm accident and 2 respiratory cases and a teenager who'd broken his wrist, and none of them had any idea where she'd been. Aldrich Sumner was indicted on 7 federal counts in the 6th week. The indictment was unsealed and became, briefly, significant news in the narrow world of federal oversight and defense contracting. Not front-page material for most publications, but the kind of story that moved through institutional channels with considerable force because the name and the position were specific enough that everyone in the relevant structure understood what it meant. The indictment named a conspiracy running across 6 years, involving redirected contract funds totaling $437 million, the destruction of compliance documentation, and the deployment of an unauthorized domestic operation against civilian targets. The tactical operators entered plea agreements. 3 of them cooperated with the investigation, and their cooperation produced 2 additional names above Sumner in the authorization structure. People whose positions in the defense oversight world were several rungs above what Pruitt's documentation had reached, and whose exposure created a secondary proceeding that generated its own set of charges and its own timeline. The 2 operators from the East Wing Passage, the ones who'd discussed framing Nora in the decommissioned corridor, faced the additional charge of conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, which carried weight that made cooperation considerably more attractive than resistance. Will Patton, Holt Meridian's security director, the man who'd given the convoy route to the wrong people, was arrested in the 4th week. He had apparently been in contact with Sumner's network for 3 years, providing operational information about Holt's movements and schedule in exchange for financial guarantees. His arrest produced a statement from Garrett Holt that was formal and carefully worded and said, in the language of corporate crisis management, that the company was cooperating fully and had taken immediate steps to review its internal security protocols. It was not a statement Nora read more than once. Warren Doyle called her in the 8th week, not on the number she'd called from the administrative office, a different number, personal, something she'd had to look up, because she'd decided that the conversation they needed to have was one she was going to initiate on her own terms. He answered on the 4th ring this time, which she appreciated. I should have told you, he said, before she'd gotten past hello, that I was connected to an active investigation. You deserved to know that before you trusted me with what you told me. You had reasons not to say it, she said. I did. They were operational reasons, and they were good ones, and they were also a way of avoiding a harder conversation. He paused. Which is that I felt responsible. For the report. For what happened to your record. I knew when I told you to write it that the channels weren't clean. I told myself I had alternatives in place to protect it, and I was wrong, and I've been carrying that. She was sitting in her car in the Hartwell General parking lot, on her break, looking at the emergency wing entrance. They'd replaced the doors 6 days after the attack. New hardware, heavier gauge, the same tan color that matched the rest of the facade. If you didn't know what had happened there, you wouldn't see it. You didn't destroy the report, she said. Sumner did. I put you in the position to be destroyed by him. I put myself in that position. I wrote the report because it was the right thing to do. Knowing there was risk doesn't change that it was right. A silence. How are you? Doyle said. I'm working night shift in a small hospital in Montana, she said. I'm fine. They're going to ask you, eventually, about coming back into some form of service. The review of your record is going to open that door. I know. What are you going to say? She looked at the entrance doors. She thought about Roy Ellenbeck and his heart, and his fear of being alone in a room at night. She thought about Dayon, the night tech she'd sent to lock himself in room 2, who'd come to find her 2 days after the attack and shaken her hand and not said anything, just shaken her hand, and that had been enough. She thought about the IV line she'd placed on Sal Brannan while a man in an expensive jacket said, "I asked for a real doctor," and the look on Fasano's face in the East Corridor, and Hugh Galter repeating her instructions back to her in the red emergency light with his chin up. I don't know yet, she said. I'll figure it out. Fair enough. Warren. She paused. The 40 minutes. Was it actually 40 minutes because that was the fastest you could move? Or was it 40 minutes because that was what you needed to have everything in position? A pause that was its own answer. I needed 38, he said. I gave myself margin. She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, Vance. She went back inside. The formal review of her service record was completed in the 4th month. The unreliability notation was removed and the file annotated with a correction that cited procedural error and administrative misconduct, which was the institutional language for what Sumner's office had done, and which was, in its way, more satisfying than a more dramatic reversal would have been. Because it was precise, because it was documented, and because it would sit in the record permanently, available to anyone who looked, for as long as records were kept. She received a letter from the review board that included a formal acknowledgement of her service and the specific compliance work she'd done that had contributed to the federal investigation. The letter used bureaucratic language, as letters from review boards did, but underneath the language was the structure of an institution trying, imperfectly and belatedly, to correct something it had gotten wrong. She read it once, folded it, and put it in the same drawer as her nursing license. She was asked twice about returning to a service role. The first inquiry was indirect. A former colleague she'd served with, passing along that certain people in certain offices had questions about her availability. She declined through the same indirect channel. The second inquiry was direct from an office she respected, and she asked for 2 weeks to think about it and then called back and said no. The person on the other end took it well, which meant they'd expected it. She wasn't running from the work. She'd done the work for 11 years and she'd been good at it. And she knew what it asked of a person, and she knew what it gave back, and the calculation had changed. Not because the work was lesser, but because something else had become clear to her in the months since a black Suburban had pulled into Hartwell General at 12:40 in the morning. She had chosen Delridge because she wanted quiet, which was true, but incomplete. The more complete truth was that she'd chosen it because she needed to find out whether the things she was good at mattered anywhere outside the specific institutional framework she'd left. Whether the ability to assess a situation quickly, to make decisions under pressure, to keep people alive when the circumstances were trying very hard to make that impossible. Whether those things had value in a rural hospital on the edge of a small Montana town where no one knew her background and no one was particularly impressed by credentials they couldn't verify. The answer was yes. She'd always suspected it was yes, but suspecting and knowing were different things, and she knew it now in a way she hadn't before the night the lights went out at 2:13 a.m. Roy Ellenbeck was discharged in the first week after a successful cardiac catheterization that the visiting cardiologist from Billings had described as a textbook procedure. On his way out, he stopped at the nurse's station where Nora was finishing a chart, and he put a hand briefly on the counter near her, not touching, just near, the gesture of an older person who has learned which forms of contact are appropriate with strangers. I heard some of what happened, he said. After, people talk. They do, she agreed. That federal agent, the one in charge, the woman. She said something to Gerald when she left. I was in the corridor, I heard it. Nora looked up from the chart. She said the nurse kept everyone alive, Roy Ellenbeck said. She said it the way people say things they mean. He paused. I thought you should know someone said it out loud. She looked at him for a moment. He had the open expression of a man delivering something he believed was owed to someone and was glad to be able to deliver it. Thank you, Roy, she said. He nodded and went home. She thought about what Kay had said for the rest of that shift and into the morning, not in a continuous way, but in the way things surface periodically when the brain decides to process them. Between patient rounds, during a medication check, while waiting for a lab result on a chest infection that turned out to be less serious than it sounded. The nurse kept everyone alive. It was not a military commendation. It was not a formal restoration. It was not the public acknowledgement of anything, just a thing one professional had said to a hospital administrator on the way out of a building, a sentence that had traveled through a corridor and reached her second hand through a cardiac patient who'd heard it while walking to the exit. It was enough. It was, in some ways, more than enough, because it was specific and direct, and it named the thing she'd actually done rather than the thing she used to be. Dion, the night tech, began treating her differently after the attack, not with deference, but with a kind of relaxed confidence in her judgment that hadn't been there before. He started anticipating her requests the way people anticipate requests when they've seen how a person thinks. And he asked more questions than he used to, not because he'd been afraid to ask before, but because he'd found a reason to be curious. She answered the questions the same way she'd always answered things, directly, without excess, giving him what he needed to actually do the job better rather than what would make him feel comfortable. Petra Solis, the ER intake tech who'd been pressed against the wall during the breach, took a 2-week leave after the attack and came back quieter than before. Nora didn't push on that. Some people process things by talking, and some people process things by working, and Petra was the second kind, and the right response to the second kind was to let them work and be there in the peripheral way that communicated steadiness without requiring engagement. By the end of the month, Petra was back to her baseline, which wasn't exactly the same as before, but was functional and was hers. Hugh Galter received a formal commendation from the county sheriff's office for his role in the evening, which he displayed on the wall of the security substation in a frame he'd clearly selected with some care. Nora saw it during a shift handoff one night and said something appropriate and moved on, and she could see in Galter's face that the commendation mattered to him in the clean way that acknowledgement matters when it's accurate. Not because he needed validation, but because the thing he'd done had been hard and frightened him, and he'd done it anyway, and someone with authority had looked at that and named it correctly. The Sumner trial began in the 7th month and was expected to last several weeks. The financial documentation Pruitt had assembled, combined with the testimony of the cooperative tactical operators and the evidence the DCIS investigation had developed independently, was described by the U.S. Attorney's Office in their public statement as among the most comprehensive contractor fraud documentation they had encountered in a decade of such prosecutions. Sumner pleaded not guilty. Nora learned this from a news alert on her phone during a break and then put her phone away and went back to work. A not guilty plea in a case with that volume of documentation was a procedural position, not a statement of reality. And the proceedings would resolve the distance between the position and the reality over the next several months in federal court with a rigor that she could not do better than by staying out of it. She had given her testimony. She had written every page of documentation that was asked of her. She had done what she could do from where she was with what she had. The rest belonged to the process, and the process, imperfect, slow, resistant to pressure, was moving. Pruitt emailed her in the 5th month, a short message, professional in its structure, but with a personal quality in the last paragraph that suggested he'd rewritten it several times. He was cooperating with the federal investigation and had been placed in a witness protection arrangement while the proceedings continued, which limited what he could say and where he could say it. He said he thought about the boiler room sometimes, not with fear, but with the specific gratitude of a person who had been in a terrible place and had been helped through it, and wanted the person who'd helped them to know it hadn't been forgotten. He didn't ask how she was. He said he hoped she was somewhere quiet, and that the work she was doing mattered to people who needed it, and she thought that was a more accurate thing to wish someone than most people managed. She wrote back briefly. She said the work was good. In the 8th month, the Hartwell General Emergency Wing was formally recognized by the Montana Department of Health for maintaining patient safety during a critical incident, which was the official language for what the night of the attack had been. The recognition came with a small ceremony that Gerald Polin organized with his characteristic combination of genuine care and logistical awkwardness, and several staff members received acknowledgments. Nora received one that was slightly different from the others. The citation named her specifically and used language that had clearly been discussed before it was written, language about clinical judgment and leadership under pressure that was technically accurate and professionally appropriate, and that anyone reading without context would find somewhat understated for what it was describing. She stood at the ceremony in the hospital's main conference room in her scrub top and received it from Poulain, who shook her hand and looked like he wanted to say something more than the certificate said and couldn't find the right words, which was fine. She told him thank you, and she meant it. The staff members who'd been there that night were in the room. She looked at their faces. Deon, Petra, Marco Fasano with his arms crossed, and that particular expression he had when he was trying to look neutral and wasn't quite managing it. And she felt something that was not triumph and not relief, but was adjacent to both of them and also to something quieter and more specific. She had done this work for 3 years without anyone knowing what she'd left behind to do it. She had chosen the night shift, chosen the small cases and the unglamorous hours, and the patients who weren't interesting to anyone outside the room they were in. And she had done that choosing without regret and without the sense that it was less than what she'd been before. She'd known something that had taken the other people in this room the night of the attack to discover. That the person who keeps the lights on matters. That the person who answers the call at 2 in the morning matters. That the skill that goes unannounced, that doesn't present itself, that operates quietly in the background of whatever drama has decided to walk through the door. That skill, in the hands of the right person, is the difference between everyone in the building living and some of them not. She had known it. She'd built her life in Delridge around the quiet truth of it, and she would keep building it, because the alternative, returning to the world that had needed her to be Captain Vance in a classified setting, doing classified work that no one would ever know about or name, was a smaller life than this one, whatever it looked like from the outside. After the ceremony, she changed into her overnight scrubs in the locker room and started her shift. The building was quiet, the way hospitals were quiet in the hours before midnight, not empty, not still, but settled into the rhythm of the night watch. The hallways had that specific quality of space where time moved differently than it did during the day, where the work was slower and more intimate and often more honest. She did her patient check, updated 2 charts, refilled a drip that was running low, sat for a few minutes with a woman in her 60s who'd been admitted for observation following a minor stroke and was frightened and awake and not quite ready to be alone with her thoughts. The woman asked her name. "Nora," she said, "are you going to be here all night?" "Until 7, Nora said. The woman nodded, and some tension left her shoulders, and she closed her eyes. Nora sat with her until her breathing evened out, and then she went back to the nurse's station and worked, and the night moved around her the way nights in small hospitals moved. Not gently, not dramatically, just steadily, with the particular weight of work that matters not because anyone is watching, but because the person in the next room needs it to be done. She had been underestimated in this building and in others. She had been dismissed, annotated, categorized as something less than she was by people who confused quiet with absence, who confused the decision not to announce herself with the absence of something to announce. Those people were in federal proceedings now, or had said something true to her across an intake room at 4 in the morning, or were patients she'd treated in the years before anyone knew there was anything to know. None of it had changed what she did. None of it changed the work, or the reason for the work, or the truth that the work carried in itself regardless of who was watching or whether they understood what they were seeing. That was the thing about genuine strength, she'd decided. It didn't wait for an audience. It didn't require one. It went on doing what it did in the emergency lighting and the quiet hours and the unremarkable moments that added up to the kind of life that mattered in ways you couldn't always measure and didn't always need to. She pulled up the next chart, checked the time, began.